Final speaker, Eliza Niewiadomska from the European Bank of Reconstruction and Development.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for this invitation. It's such a nice thing to end up on a panel with girls for a change. I'm sorry. Normally I'm the only person who's not wearing a tie and a suit, and it's really, really nice to be in such a lovely company. May I get this technical thing to use the slides? Thank you. Well, not that I have anything against the moderator, obviously. Thank you. So I'm here today because the organizers asked me to focus on a very practical question from our own practice. I'm a public procurement lawyer. I work with EBRD on public procurement policy. So it was very interesting for me to see the findings from the research undertaken, because this is something that exactly fits the way we work and how we perhaps could improve the things we do. I hope it does work. It does not. Can you please tell me how to use it properly? I see. Oh, okay. Thank you so much. Apologies. Well, two things about EBRD, because I am not exactly sure how much you know about the bank. There has been a discussion here about MDBs. We are one of them. We are a very strange animal because we work with private sector. Some of you here, they know about us. For the rest of you, we are working in transition markets. So whatever I say relates to this part of the world. We have a mandate to work with private sector, and that's why the program I work with is actually focused on the private sector. I'm a part of the legal transition program, and I'm a procurement lawyer working for this team. Our work is to support policy development. So I am here with you to have a look from a different perspective on corruption and collusion. I have joined the bank in 2009. When internally it has been decided that it would be good to have someone who will work with the countries that want to implement reforms. So what I do in my work, I work with the governments who want to do something. And obviously I prefer to work with the governments who are ambitious. And typically we have governments who are having a huge corruption problem. So my perspective, it's a very specific one. This is a disclaimer for all of you who work on European market, who work on the US market. We work everywhere from Poland, where I come from, up to Mongolia in Central Asia. And since 2012, we work with North African countries and recently with the Middle East. So these are the economies that we qualify as transition economies. They have their own problems. And what we do, we are trying to address these problems. My job is within the public procurement policy. So how we work with the countries. We try to identify the best practice on the market. We try to bring it to the legal standard setting efforts that are run by international community. My job is to know what's going on in the country, and my job is to facilitate political discussion and reform agenda with the governments. So we obviously want to see reforms that are tackling corruption, and we obviously want to see reforms that are developing private sector economy. So we see ourselves as a very distinct force on the ground, working with the governments who are promoting market economy reforms, and working with corruption topics and working with the competition problems. It's a part of our daily life as it happens. So for us, the objective is to help the governments to create policies that are permitting different types of procurement, from very low value to very high value, and to fit it the way that potentially we can have no corruption problem in the ideal case, and we can have competition applied to the market the way that we don't experience the problems with the collusion cases. So how we work? We work with the governments promoting the competition in procurement, promoting the transparency in procurement. We develop technical cooperation programs for them, And part of what I do is basically to deal with the case of complexity that has been already mentioned, because procurement is complex. And procurement is complex because we are touching on the competition on the market, we are touching on the transparency issues, we are touching on something the governments like to call, following Anglo-Saxons, value for money. And on the top of this, we have unstable economies. So this is something that is giving the picture for us regarding how policy is developing. So in transition economies, when we have the ambitious government that wants to do something, we know that they typically want to do. So if we have a case that government is determined to run anti-corruption program, we should focus on these aspects of procurement policy that help them to achieve it. On the other hand, our private sector interest pushes for agenda of supporting competitive markets that deliver value for government and deliver value for the private sector. So we see that governments have different objectives. They may have an objective of fighting corruption. They may have an objective of growing the internal market. And this is something where we have to operate somehow, and this was very interesting to hear a case from Japan, because typically when we start to discuss with the government what's your ideal view of your own internal market, we start with asking a very simple question. Is your market economy an open one or closed? And if you want us to design procurement policy that is working on a closed market, or it's working on the open market? And this is something fundamental for us, because different policies may work well or better depending what's the attitude to the market in the government. And finally, we have seen a lot of government efforts focused on e-governance and e-procurement and any sort of type of going digital. And we have to recognize that this is sometimes serving the government to look nicer, and sometimes it's being used to actually achieve something. And our job is to make sure that whatever we are trying to do, following either anti-corruption agenda or market development agenda, is making the best use of modern tools that we now have. And trying to answer this question the organizers put in front of me, whether we at EBRD, we have an agenda of fighting corruption, I have to answer that we don't. We are not the World Bank, and we don't focus on supporting institutions that are fighting corruption. So we are not supporting all this nice crowd that was described by the previous presentation. We just don't do it. What we do, we totally support preventing the corruption cases and developing the policies that are safeguarding against corruption, but we don't do any work working with the institutions that are fighting the corruption. So we see ourselves on the ground promoting transparency, promoting competition, and creating procurement policies that are fitting the market challenge as we see it in the specific country. And here we are now recognizing two very strong forces, which is the open government agenda. And this is something where we totally agree with OECD, with the World Bank on pushing for government being more open, because this typically helps us to prevent corruption taking place. The more information you give, the more transparent you are as a government, the less likely procurement policy will be serving to extract bribes. And on the other hand, we are recognizing that there needs to be a balance between the transparency and the competition in procurement policy. So I personally, I would perhaps be tempted to go totally open, so have a transparency as a default, because I'm coming from Poland. And we have got a very bad history when the government was closed and not sharing the information. And this is the specific history that some of our countries have, and in these countries, we are supporting full transparency agenda. Here, a very good example is the one mentioned in the previous session, Georgia. And this country has got an open government agenda for a while, and we see how beneficial it is for their procurement policy. On the other hand, we understand that there are countries where full transparency agenda will not work, mainly because these countries, they don't want to open their markets. So if you have transparency agenda but a closed market, it's rather unlikely that you will achieve anything good except supporting collusion. So what we do at the moment working with these topics, we were trying to identify on the ground whether fighting corruption actually helps fighting collusion. And here we have heard a number of criticism being linked to how much more transparency is actually helping to create collusion on the market, that it's against competition principles. And I have to say that we totally disagree. We disagree provided that certain other conditions are met. And these other conditions, these are the cases where more transparency is actually resulting in less collusion on the market. It can be true for our own transition countries, but we do hope that it can be true for other economies as well. And here I wanted to bring to your attention a couple of cases which are very basic for the policy, but we observe them working in practice. We know that market allocation, we know that pushing for direct awarding, we know that cover bidding is almost everywhere, including Europe, where competition law is very strong. We have to work with the countries where competition law is very weak. So what we are trying to do, we are trying to determine which conditions are actually helping to achieve both targets, how to use more transparency to have less collusion. And looking at the cases that we have been working with over the last 5 years, we believe that the critical thing is actually how much your market is open. So if you have a look at World Bank doing business research and the ranking, and if you will look at Transparency International Corruption Perception Index, you will frequently see a very interesting correlation. The countries that are improving their doing business rating, they are also improving on Transparency International scale. It means that when they are trying to get their market in a better shape, has less red tape, and encourage more the growth in the private sector, they are actually improving the outcome on the anti-corruption side as well. And looking at what we have seen ourselves for us, sorry, this is most, oh goodness me, this is the wrong way. So what we have found for ourselves, we have been down to very basic truths. And these are the following. When we have governments who support competition on the public procurement market, we typically have less problems with corruption and less problems with collusion. On the other hand, when we don't see full transparency of procurement decision, it may be very surprising, but we see more corruption cases and more collusion cases. And finally, the question of the closed and open market. The lower entry barriers, the more likely you have less collusion. And the more likely you have a happy private sector. And this is something that worked very well in our cases of Georgia, Ukraine, Kyrgyz Republic, and when we could observe that actually decreasing the entry level to procurement market is serving very well both cases. There is less corruption and there is less collusion because there is less incentive for companies to collude if they are threatened by the competition from the international bidders, or when we are promoting new entries to procurement market from small business. And this is working particularly well in Ukraine, which has a very bad tradition of being a very corrupt environment and having basically very little real competition on the market and very oligarchic structure of the market. And finally, the way the e-procurement is being used. We are working with the countries that want to use e-procurement to have a tool that is actually tracking public spending. And that's why we encourage the governments to look at e-procurement agenda as a method to deal with the entire public procurement cycle. If you are able to achieve a digital process from planning to payment, first thing, you are giving less opportunity for corruption, and secondly, you are much better prepared to monitor and detect both corruption and collusion. And this is something my colleagues working on Transparency International Ukraine projects can tell you more. But this is exactly what we were able to achieve working together in Ukraine, where there are access to actual information how the procurement is done and what prices are and who is bidding and who is winning and whether we see the same companies returning with the same tenders. Or perhaps we are finally able to answer why a specific company is always selected in single source but never participates in competitive bidding. It helps. And it also helps us to utilize the civil society where they are most effective. And honestly speaking, civil society is not effective when we talk about planning procurement or designing the procurement strategy. They don't have expertise there. And similarly, they are not effective when you try to involve them in tender evaluation panels or you try to involve them in supervising as a third party because they typically will not have capacity to actually contribute to better evaluation of tenders. But what is their forte, and we have seen it played very well, it is how well they can monitor procurement outcome. And this is something where I totally agree with a speaker in the previous session, that the more we know how actually money is spent on actual contracts, the better we know how good our procurement is. Because civil society is really excellent to extract the value from the supplier on public contract if they are permitted to do so. And this is, again, a huge benefit for the policy people like me when we can focus on making the policy reasonably good, fitting the local market well, balancing transparency and competition, using the electronic tools where they serve us best, and working with civil society where can actually come back to us saying, this road has been badly built, look into it. Or this school is giving bad meals, look into it. And these are the cases where no one else except civil society will be able to signal the first problem, and then we can dig out deeper, and most probably we will find a corruption case, or most probably we will find a collusion case. All from me, thank you so much.